Sarah had always wanted to go to Disney World. For years, she had devoured anything and everything that had come out of Walt's massive empire. She was well versed in the classics: Cinderella, 101 Dalmatians, The Little Mermaid. She knew all the new releases as well: Toy Story, Moana, The Princess and the Frog. You name it, she had seen it and loved it. She loved the stories. She could quote the lines. She could sing all of the songs. You can imagine the unbridled joy that burst out of her when, for her birthday, her parents surprised her with the trip of a lifetime: a family voyage to Disney World. They spent weeks planning out every last detail: flights, hotel rooms, rental cars, even the best route to take throughout the park. Sarah spent those weeks rewatching all of her favorite movies and practicing her princess pose so she'd be ready when she got to take pictures with her favorite characters. Finally, the day had come. The family loaded up all of their bags and suitcases into the car. They grabbed their backpacks that they'd stuffed with snacks for the airplane. They backed out of the driveway and headed for the airport. They breezed through town and merged onto the highway. The first half of their 20-minute voyage went absolutely perfectly, but then things began to change. All of a sudden, cars began braking and slowing down. A few cars dodged back and forth trying to find the fastest moving lane, and then it happened. The cars in front of them slowed, and then slowed some more, until finally, all of a sudden, no one was moving. All of the traffic on the once bustling interstate had ground to a standstill. Sarah watched from the back seat as her parents craned their necks to try and see what was happening. She looked out of her window and saw other drivers doing the same thing. Honks filled the air. Frustrated commuters waved frantically, yelling at the insides of their windshields, but to no avail. There was nothing ahead but a sea of glaring, angry, red brake lights. 5 minutes passed. 10 minutes passed, and still no movement. She listened intently as her parents began to discuss their options. "What do we do?" they asked. They still had a couple of hours before the flight was scheduled to leave, but they did have to check some bags and get through security and find their gate. There was a window, but the clock was ticking. They looked at the highway out the front window, and they discussed the possibility of maybe bullying their way through. Maybe they could skirt over onto the shoulder for a mile or two and wedge their way into an exit, fight through the standstill. They looked out the rear window, and they discussed just going home. There was a small space on their left where they could make a U-turn and join the free-flowing traffic moving in the opposite direction. They could just give up, resign themselves to the fact that Disney World would have to wait. And so, with these two paths laid out before them, the real debate began. Do we push, or do we give up? Do we fight, or do we quit? And as Sarah listened to this debate, she couldn't get rid of one nagging question. A question that neither of her parents seemed to be considering. What if, Sarah pondered, what if there was another path to the airport? What if there was another way? Jesus has been preaching for a bit now in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5. He's warmed up. I'm sure at this point that he's already made his listeners squirm at least once or twice. He's talked about blessing the poor and the persecuted. He's talked about the need for his followers to be forces of good in the world. He's given some hard teachings, like challenging them to eradicate anger instead of just refraining from murder. He's talked about adultery and divorce and about keeping one's word and living honestly. But none of that probably prepared them for what he would say next. A teaching so radical that even now, thousands of years later, his followers struggle to apply it. A teaching that is so counterintuitive to our basic response. Jesus continues. You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Once again, Jesus returns to a law that they were incredibly familiar with, a law that we can find several references to in the Old Testament. The first one occurs in Exodus 21, beginning in verse 22. If people are fighting and hit a pregnant woman and she gives birth prematurely, but there is no serious injury, the offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands and the court allows. But if there is serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. It appears in Leviticus chapter 24. Anyone who injures their neighbor is to be injured in the same manner, fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. The one who has inflicted the injury must suffer the same injury. And we see it again in Deuteronomy chapter 19. The judges must make a thorough investigation, and if the witness proves to be a liar, giving false testimony against a fellow Israelite, then do to the false witness as that witness intended to do to the other party. You must purge the evil from among you. The rest of the people will hear of this and be afraid, and never again will such an evil thing be done among you. Show no pity. Life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Some might be shocked to learn that the phrase eye for an eye is in fact in our Bible, and it exists in several different places. But as is the case most of the time, context really matters. The Deuteronomy text makes it clear, but most of these texts exist within the same context, which is the courtroom. These are legal statutes. These are guidelines instructing judges or those responsible for the legal system on how to respond in the case of certain injuries. Now, in our context and in our interpretation, the phrase eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth might seem pretty harsh. In fact, it has a connotation of being pretty barbaric. However, kind of like the certificate of divorce that we talked about a few weeks ago, this was a revolutionary thing in its time. The law interrupted the cycle of escalating violence and retribution. It limited the retaliation to the extent of the original injury and no further. Think about it. If someone hurts you, is your first thought to hurt them back to the exact same extent? Or maybe is our first thought to hurt them a little farther, a little harder, a little bit more than what they had done to us? And then the other person's response is a little bit further than your response, and then we have this escalating scale of retaliation. And where does it end? So, we have a law for a courtroom that instructs the judges to resolve the situation by limiting the damages to the extent of the original offense. The reason that Jesus had to talk about this is because the Pharisees and the teachers of the law had taken this statute out of the courtroom. They had begun to teach eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth as a proper response in personal relationships. What began as an instruction for judges had become the motto for vigilante justice. Famously, biologists and psychologists have acknowledged an ingrained response to stresses. We call it fight or flight. When confronted by an acute stress, human beings and animals alike mostly respond in one of two ways. They fight back or they turn and run away. I think if we really boil it down, we view many interactions through these two opportunities. If someone hurts me, insults me, or harms me, I can fight back or I can roll over, to use the colloquial term. I can give up. We can get revenge or we can quit. We also might be tempted to read this text through that lens as well. Through the lens of fight or flight, we read Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 through 42, and it sure seems like Jesus is telling us to give up. In fact, it might seem like Jesus is asking us to take on more hurt and pain. But maybe there's something else happening here. Maybe Jesus is suggesting something completely countercultural. Maybe Jesus is proposing another way. You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Let's start with Jesus' first example. Jesus is oddly specific here. Notice that Jesus doesn't say, if someone hits you, let them hit you again. He says, if someone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. If I'm facing you and I slap you on your right cheek, I have to do one of two things. I either have to slap you with my left hand or I have to backhand you. In a Jewish society, both of these are completely disrespectful and punishable. In fact, slapping someone with the left hand could lead to a banishment of up to 10 days, and the backhand is an abusive action even to this day. The attacker here has slapped with the intent of humiliation, the intent to denigrate someone else. And so Jesus says, turn to them the other cheek. This would bring the attacker and the victim eye to eye. For them to hit you on the left cheek means that they would have to hit you as an equal and not as an inferior. Shane Claiborne writes, do not cower and do not punch back. Make sure the person looks into your eyes and sees your sacred humanity. And so Jesus asks his followers, turn the left cheek also. Make them see you as a human being. Restore your dignity in front of that person and let them know that it won't be taken from you. And if they want to hit you again, they will have to hit you as an equal. Next, Jesus says, if anyone wants to sue you and take off your shirt, hand over your coat as well. This is another reference to an abuse of power. Only the poorest of the poor would be sued for their shirts. The shirt was the last thing that a person could take from someone else if they owed them money. This was a sign to everyone else that that person had lost everything. Obviously, there's no monetary value in a poor person's shirt. This was an act meant to, again, humiliate them and show everyone else that they owed more than they could pay. The one thing that a person could never have taken from them was their coat. Especially for the poor, their coat was a lifeline. It was used for bedding and a blanket in the cold and as a cover during the day. It was deemed inhumane to take the coat from someone. Giving up the shirt and the coat would leave someone essentially naked. Nakedness was, of course, taboo in Jewish culture, but the interesting thing is the shame fell on the person who looked upon the nakedness of someone else or who caused the nakedness of someone else. And so Jesus tells his impoverished followers to let them take everything, and in doing so, expose the greed and turn the shame on them for taking their coat and the shirt from you and taking the very shirt off of your back. Jesus continues, if someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Soldiers in these days, of course, didn't have trucks and trailers to carry all of their gear, so they moved on foot and had to carry their armor and their weapons in their hands. So the law dictated that a soldier could require a civilian to help them carry their equipment. The law specified, though, that the civilian could not be forced to walk more than 1 mile. In fact, asking them to go beyond that 1 mile, any further beyond that 1 mile, was an infraction of the military code. Also, keep in mind that these are Roman soldiers, so not one of Jesus' Jewish followers would have been pleased to carry a Roman soldier's equipment. Can you imagine the responses that a soldier was accustomed to getting when they asked for help with their gear from a civilian? If the normal response was to throw a fit, spit on the ground, and begrudgingly drag along for a mile, can you imagine how it would feel if someone just agreed? And then when the end of that mile came, and most people threw the armor on the ground and stomped off, can you imagine what kind of impact it would have if someone said, "That's okay, let's keep going"? The parable of Sarah and her parents seems silly when we read it, right? It doesn't represent reality. No one in their right mind would only consider these two options when stuck in traffic, especially when on the way to a dream vacation. You would try every option available, right? We'd be mapping out every possible route to the airport. And yet, when faced with pain that has been caused by another person, we so rarely ever consider any other options. We fight or we give up. What Jesus proposes here is a third way, a different path, a radically alternate route, a route paved in love, in nonviolence, a route paved in de-escalation. Walter Wink, in his book, The Powers That Be, writes this: "This third way teaches that evil can be opposed without being mirrored. Oppressors can be resisted without being emulated. Enemies can be neutralized without being destroyed. This is the art of the third way. This is the art of Jesus' holy imagination." Paul puts it this way in Romans 12. "Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, 'It is mine to avenge. I will repay,' says the Lord. On the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." May we be a people that overcomes evil with good. May we be a people of the third way. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock.